it's a short travel from there to a $3,600 keyboard. And you can see the connection for me, right? Is I want to create something that is like so over the top crazy that it doesn't feel like it's part of the normal, everyday world of commerce, that is hyper optimized for things that, a small group of people will care deeply about in terms of the visual aesthetics, the materials, the acoustics, really arcane engineering from first principles, things that we've done. It's in no way would a rational person who's not a keyboard enthusiast have ever done any of these things. But it's just it comes from my emotional attachment to this idea of people who wish to create some sort of carve out and a bit of escapism in the world like Disney did.
Buttery.
I'm Ryan Norbauer from Norbauer and Company, and this is Behind the Brand with Ryan Elliott.
Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the show. Ryan, welcome.
Thank you.
I usually ask my guests, how did you get this job?
Oh, that's an interesting way to start, because I'm actually kind of allergic to the term job. I think you probably talk to a lot of entrepreneurs, and I think you probably would consider yourself one as well. And I think a lot of us don't think of ourselves as having a job, right? I realize I didn't exactly answer your question, but and I'm happy to. But do you consider yourself as having a job?
Yes, in the crudest way possible, yes. I think of myself as a multi-hyphenate, right? Like on paper, I'm a writer, director, producer, but I'm also I take out the trash and I pay the rent and
I don't know,
building.
I think I'm overly sensitive about that word in a way because I think of entrepreneurship as essentially like creating assets, right? And definitely a lot of work goes into that. Like I'm have this kind of life-destroying obsession with, I'm a workaholic basically, right? So I have no aversion to work per se, as long as I'm doing it, sort of on my own terms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've ever since college, I would say, I made a resolution. I don't want to work for anybody else. This is a character flaw, mind you. I'm not ennobling it in any way, but I think that as long as I can sort of rationalize what I'm doing as the cultivation of an asset or making things for people or something like that, that it feels very voluntary. And so I have to trick myself into, the comfort with that level of work for whatever it's worth.
I can relate with that actually.
Yeah. I just, if you ask people who are entrepreneurs, I think it's just there's this extraordinary diversity of things that draw people to entrepreneurship. But one common feature, I think, is a high value on freedom, right? And personal autonomy.
100%.
And again, this is I recognize in some ways this is a defect in my character, but it is a characteristic, aspect of my nature that's really important to me, right? So sorry, I was just slightly triggered by the word. I can actually answer the question that you were asking, which is how did I get to this extremely weird line of work that I'm in?
And I would say too, Ryan, let's halt the apologies right now.
Okay.
Because part of the reason I wanted to have you on is because of what I see as the riches are in the niches, if I'm going to butcher, another French word probably.
No, niche is so I did an interview once where because I use the word niche a lot, obviously because it's related extremely much to what I do. And someone in the comments was like, Norbauer has a degree in French. I can't believe he says niche, but it is niche in English. It's an actual English word.
Okay.
Please proceed.
I love it. And so I love the quirkiness. I love the, I sort of am seeing the sprockets in your brain, and I'm fascinated with how different brains work. I've talked to 500 plus different brains over the time that we've done this podcast, and each one is a little bit different. And so, to have one that works and operates the way yours does, no apologies necessary. In fact, I think it's endearing and also probably one of your unfair advantages.
I have an excess of sprockets, for better or worse.
But seeing things that maybe other people don't, or having a lack of tolerance for things that other people won't.
Sure.
Is unique. I want to dive into that,
yeah.
And how that has spurred this very interesting new business, or this ongoing business that you've created and built into this brand. But so let's take it back in the chronology a little bit. Sure. To young Ryan, Virginia boy, not having much experience out there in the world. What did you want to be when you grew up? What were you thinking of young Ryan?
Well, so to be precise, it's West Virginia, which is even worse. And I'm actually very fond of West Virginia in certain ways, but it was very culturally isolated, right? And it's very interesting to grow up in a place where you're constantly exposed to culture from the United States and the world, where stories are told about every other place on Earth, but never the place where you come from, right? And so you imagine that the outside world must be extraordinarily interesting and compelling, and that all of these amazing stories and intelligent people that you read in books, that's the outside world, and where you come from is this like waiting room, right? And that's how I felt about West Virginia in many ways. And so I was really drawn as a child to what you might describe as escapist ideas, right, or escapist fiction. I particularly love Star Trek: The Next Generation because it portrayed this vision of the future where humanity would not be preoccupied with the accumulation of wealth and status, but would sort of, because it's like a post-scarcity economy. That's the key narrative conceit of Star Trek. Is they've discovered something about physics that allows us to, rearrange matter in a way that makes the resource scarcity no longer matter. Right. And so it's kind of like a thought experiment in fiction, or at least the original early Star Treks. And that idea was very compelling to me because I grew up in this like very kind of homogenous environment that was very it's true of almost any social environment in schools, but it's like very kind of cliquey, and people are very judgmental about people being different and unusual, and
there's a lot of camo.
Sure. I mean, it's just the and hunting and all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So I was this like super nerdy kid, and I didn't really fit into that world, and I felt the pressures of like non-acceptance. And there were these portrayals that in the future, through technology, through the uniting of all of humanity, through communications and our discovery that we're not alone in the universe, and all of these ideas that would mean that the future would be different, and that workplaces would look like these very collaborative, tolerant, accepting environments. It's like, in some ways, it's like a workplace drama, an idealized workplace drama.
Yeah, but it was a fantasy where you could start thinking of a new chapter or a better life outside of the one that you were in.
Yeah. And so, I really wanted to sort of step into that world. And like, even as a kid, I was very obsessed with because it was so alluring to me aesthetically, that beautiful vision, everything about it I wanted to like step into. So I became really enamored of the production design of that world. Star Trek: The Next Generation in particular had this very strange production design ethos, which is it was like supposed to look like a luxury liner in space.
Right.
Normal science fiction is very sort of hard-edged and silver and black, and it's meant to look very sort of techy.
The Cybertruck.
Yeah, exactly. Which is also something that appeals to me because I associate it with other aspects of 1980s futurism, which, were still exciting to me. But specifically, The Next Generation had this kind of soft-edged, warm quality with natural materials and wool and sort of like pastel colors.
The cruise liner.
Yeah, exactly.
In space.
Because the idea was like humanity by this point would be so accustomed to living in space that we would be focused on making it comfortable and familiar.
Yeah, more aesthetics.
And, just sort of tactical stamp.
Utility, yeah.
Yeah. And so that all made a strong impression on me, this vision that like in the future, everything is going to be so, warm and friendly and approachable and tolerant. And, it's a beautiful vision. And that somehow like indelibly left a mark on me.
Yeah.
How did
your parents feel about that?
Well,
were they supportive and like?
In a way. I mean, they always knew they had a very weird kid in me.
Yeah. But were they weird? Was it in the DNA?
No, not at all. Okay. I mean, so my father has, and his mother before him, have like a contrarian streak in their nature. They're very, it's the one thing I'm most grateful to have gotten from either of my parents is they're very skeptical of, or my father's very skeptical of like well-established social narratives about how you're supposed to be happy. So he's never been concerned with the pursuit of social status in any way.
Yeah.
And
what the Joneses are doing.
Yeah. Or like just general like political narratives, religious narratives, philosophical narratives that are very like moralizing. He's kind of like, he and my grandmother were always just like, don't listen to what people say. Just have a good life because you'll be gone before you know it. Enjoy it. Right. And I'm very grateful to them for having imparted to me this kind of skepticism about standard established, highly tracked ideas about what your life is supposed to be like.
Yeah. Gives you lots of options.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyway, so that was all sort of a detour about my childhood obsession with futurism, right? And so like another thing that was very compelling to me is like I went to Epcot Center when I was a child.
Okay.
Are you familiar with this? It's like a park. Yeah. And so it's very different today from what it was. But in the 1980s, when I went there, it was all about how the future is going to be amazing.
Yeah.
Right. And there's a certain like design language also associated with that, which is, I think, very consonant with what you see in Star Trek: The Next Generation. It's very sort of round edged, soft, sleek, and
city of the future.
Yeah. And it was very, again, for a super nerdy kid, it was this, there's like half of the park was just called Future World, I think. And it was all how the future is going to be amazing and how all of the things that are disappointing about life now are going to be gone in 30 years.
Right.
So it's just like part of the culture from, I would say, the 1950s, like post-war America until, early 2000s. And something about that just really like lodged itself in my brain. And so a lot of the things that I kind of aspired to want to do as a child related to these things. One of the things I always said I wanted to be was an Imagineer, right? Because it's like this intersection between art and engineering, which is what I've actually ended up doing for most of my adult life, happily. Mm-hmm. But also just like I was very drawn to technology, not because I'm like, I don't love computer science and algorithm design or any sort of the arcane aspects of computing, but computing was a really important part of these ideas about the future. And I was very drawn to like, how can we create that future, right? So I have this strong positive association to early computers of that era, which is how I sort of ended up, becoming obsessed with keyboards.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like you wanted to be part of building your future vision.
Yeah. I mean, so my big hobby as a kid was making prop replicas from Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Okay.
Go to these conventions and people would sell like castings that had been smuggled out from the studios here in Hollywood of like,
the props.
The props, right? And there was something about just like reaching into the world and touching it and making it a little bit more real that was so compelling to me. I cannot begin to tell you how obsessed I was with this hobby as a kid because I just wanted to have some little piece of this beautiful future and bring it into my present, rather boring young West Virginia life.
Mm-hmm. It makes it real.
Yeah,
you have
exactly.
literally have a piece of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's something about something that is escapist, but also tactile, right? And physical and real. And I think that's one of the things also about Epcot that was compelling, right? Is it's not just like a beautiful story on television. It was kind of this world that you could enter that felt like it was the future or what we thought the future was going to be like.
Yeah. I mean, I've read a little bit of Walt Disney stuff, and his main strength was just vision where there was no vision, right? Like he would look at orange groves in Anaheim and see a huge theme park, or he would see, major motion picture Snow White, or, his ability to see it before it happened or visualize it.
Yeah. And like most of the entrepreneurs that I admire and people who are sometimes, retrospectively described as visionaries, they, everyone thought he was crazy, absolutely crazy.
Yeah. Even his brother.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can't do this.
Reasonably, prudently, perhaps, because in many cases that perspective is right. But, Snow White in particular was this insane project because no one had ever made a feature-length animated film. And he's like, nope, we're going to do it. Trust me, if the product is good, people will love it. And it was like it came to be known supposedly around Hollywood as Walt's Folly for many years because it was this, megalomaniacal, crazy, project.
Expensive. I think it was like $100,000 at the time.
And nobody had any concept that, anyone would care to see such a thing. And it was the first time that, there's the idea was to target both adults and children and all of that. And I love people like that who are just like, no, everything that everyone says, I don't think so. We're going to try this another way.
Yeah.
I really, really admire that.
Yeah. Well, I could go down this rabbit hole with you on Walt Disney. I love a lot of this history. You know that he created those little animated shorts, right? Mm-hmm. With the, it was a rabbit.
Sure, Oswald.
And then through sort of unfortunate business dealing, the bigger studio was able to capture Oswald's property. So he had no other choice but to start from scratch.
That's right.
And, it was also during this time when he was really kind of depressed about the whole matter that he started going to sort of out back and creating little mini sets for what would later become basically the vision for Disneyland.
Sure.
And it's just incredible because Roy was like really worried about his brother and thinking what's going to happen. And he's like, I'm doing my thing. And everyone thought you're ridiculous for creating these little setups. But
yeah, I mean, there's another interesting kind of side lesson here about that, which is that everyone, every Walt Disney has his Roy, I think, in some ways.
Yeah. The yin to the yang.
Yeah. Like this is like, I'm just not, it's not that I'm horrible at business exactly. I just really don't like certain aspects of it that I feel like are not creatively satisfying. And so I tend to neglect those aspects whenever I alone am running or start, being the founder of a company. And I'm just increasingly appreciating how important it is to have one's Roy. Yeah, there's obviously at Apple, like Steve Jobs, I admire his also sort of visionary approach. Obviously, a person like all of us with certain character flaws, but nevertheless, he made something that would not have existed otherwise. And that to me is like the ultimate value of someone who does anything creative, is like leave the world looking a little bit different. Like, I don't necessarily believe this means anything in the cosmic sense. I just aesthetically find it appealing to live a life that creates a little bit of something that makes the world looking a little bit different. And so Steve Jobs, obviously extraordinarily important in that, the history and trajectory of Apple, but Tim Cook is also a very important person in the history of Apple well before he became CEO, in that he was the Roy to Steve Jobs in many ways, just like in many ways, just sort of working out the logistics and financial aspects that made the whole creative machine actually function.
Yeah, counterbalance, nurture versus someone who just steamrolled other people's personalities.
Yeah. So, whenever you see these very successful creative visionaries, people that I admire, like Gene Roddenberry also was another example of this. He was this like very sort of pie in the sky idealistic person, but he had this sort of rapacious killer lawyer, Leonard Maizlish, I think was his name, who, handled all the business affairs and make sure that he didn't get screwed by the studios. And Roddenberry eventually did very, very well by that. And as a result, his creative vision made its way into the world in a way that wouldn't have possibly otherwise. Mm-hmm. And I'm just increasingly appreciating how important that is for whatever that's worth.
Yeah. You talk about Hemingway in your blogs a lot. Who's Hemingway's Roy, you think? If he's off the reservation, working basically at the Red Cross because he couldn't enlist in the military during the war, helping with injured people.
I think you know more about Hemingway than I do, honestly. But
I'm trying to think. I think maybe probably his wife was his counterbalance, but she couldn't really do much in the end to help him because he was just sort of a troubled soul, maybe.
Sure. I mean, I think people who sort of step back from life and try to look at it objectively, which is in many ways the goal of a writer and novelist in particular, oftentimes don't come back with a happy or rosy view of that. And there's something about that particular social role of being a sort of writer or thinker that doesn't necessarily lead us to the happiest conclusions. Some of my favorite creators or auteurs, if we'll use a slightly pompous term, are people who fall into this category, who kind of look closely at the world and are not really happy with what they see. I particularly have always loved the films of Woody Allen. I find them very kind of existentially soothing, even though they deal with very depressing, subject matter frequently, sort of existential, philosophical, cosmicist ideas. It's clearly like a product of that worldview. I really like this French novelist, Michel Houellebecq, not very well known here in the English-speaking world, but also like a very dark view of humanity and kind of, or at least let's say 21st century human social interactions. Mm-hmm. And I'm really drawn to that. This like almost scientific. My undergraduate degree is in experimental psychology, right? And in some ways, there's like a worldview or stance of psychology, particularly experimental psychology, which is like, let's step back from the human experience and let's put on latex gloves and sort of examine it as an alien might, right? And I think that really perceptive, interesting writers do that, right? And if you're going to do that in a way that is intellectually rigorous, you may not like what you find, right? It can be kind of depressing, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because the things that really stand the test of time, they're so spot on and so on point. You know, you look at what Plato or Socrates wrote 2,000 years ago. They had it really dialed in. Human nature. Like,
sure,
even 2,000 years ago, they just nailed it. Or you look at Shakespeare, whoever wrote Shakespeare, Orwell. I mean, just all of these people just had the human condition, the human brain sort of already nailed.
Yeah. To this, I would also add the ancient Stoics as well.
Absolutely. Right? Marcus Aurelius. And
yeah. I'm a particular admirer of Seneca, but Aurelius certainly as well. And they're just like, much of the contemporary wisdom of sort of like practical psychology is essentially just a restatement of things that were discovered by the Stoics a very long time ago. And, separately sort of by Buddhists and Taoists. And there's like all of these kind of, you might say, like convergent intellectual evolution of people all kind of realizing that there's sort of practical wisdom about how do we deal with this, emotional software that we're endowed with.
Mm-hmm.
I find that very interesting.
Yeah, me too. Sidebar, did you hear, so William Shatner went to space, right?
Yes.
I think a la Jeff Bezos. Mm-hmm. And did you hear kind of what his summary of the experience was?
I don't remember. I think it was kind of funny, as I recall.
It was funny and ironic, and I can't quote it perfectly, but basically, after going to space and after being someone who is such a, discover, what's the catchphrase, the Star Trek catchphrase?
I don't know, actually.
What is there? It's like in every opening scene or every closing thing, they talk about exploring.
Where no man has gone before?
Yeah. He realized in that moment, after he saw sort of the Earth, in his rear view, mm-hmm. that being on Earth and having the nothingness, the dark, black abyss of being in space was so lonely mm-hmm. and so scary, terrified him, that he realized that, discovering new frontiers and space is a new frontier, like, no, I want to be on Earth.
Sure.
Where it's all happening, where, it's warm and friendly and there's oxygen. And it terrified him.
Yeah. This has been kind of my own intellectual trajectory, mostly for the worse over the course of my life. As I mentioned, I had this childhood obsession with the idea of space exploration, which was really just a narrative conceit created to explore the ideas of like, what would it look like if humanity were capable of self-improvement, right? That's basically the premise of Star Trek, and it's just like incidentally set in space. It's not about space. But still, I had this romanticism about space exploration and, discovering the cosmos or other species and all of this as a child. But, I would say that a common path for people who grow up very idealistic is to, experience repeated confrontations with reality and the disillusionment that comes with that,
Right.
And subsequently, I've been really drawn to the ideas of H.P. Lovecraft, who's like basically articulates this exact idea, right? Is because he was very also obsessed with astronomy and sort of what from a scientific perspective appears to be a totally indifferent universe. And his even though he was rigorously materialistic and he was very he never abandoned his sort of scientific worldview. He, unlike someone like Richard Dawkins or sort of the contemporary like new atheists, he did not hold the view that increasing scientific knowledge and humanity's self-awareness actually leads to greater happiness. His view was that a rigorous, honest view of humanity's very fragile place in this vast, indifferent cosmos is actually very terrifying, and that every step as we learn more about the nature of reality and physics tends to diminish humanity's role in the grand narrative of the universe, and that this has basically been the progress of civilization over the years, and that this does not necessarily lead to human happiness, right?
Yeah. I mean, all of this is probably like 30 or 50 IQ points over my head, but it's fascinating to me to at least start thinking about. Let's go back to where you maybe had your first opportunity. You've written about, I worked for NASA, and I know you have studied and speak French, and, all these different eclectic skills that you've got. Who gave you your first big break, do you feel like? Even despite the fact you don't really want to work for anyone else, but you did go to work for someone else at first.
Sure. I mean, I was a kid. My first job was at NASA. You're right. I got this sort of internship that was very kind of competitive when I was a kid.
Very cool.
Yeah, I was like maybe a freshman or in my second year in high school. And I was just like, as I mentioned, because of Star Trek, I was very obsessed with technology, the early days of the internet, software. I was like playing around with HTML and CSS before anyone had ever barely heard of any of those things, like the very first like beta version of CSS. And so I went to this interview and I talked to the people about that, and they were like, wow, this is a very young person who is interested in these things that like we barely know anything about. And so just by quirk of my weird, morbid curiosity and obsession with technology, I got this job. And I think it's like, as you'll appreciate, given the premise of your show, like a lot of things in life, for better or worse, are just about like branding, right? And this was good early branding for me as a kid. It's like, oh, he got to work at NASA when he was really young,
Yeah.
And yeah, the work was interesting, but I was not like building the space shuttle. I was helping them build the computer networks at a NASA facility that did verification and validation of software.
Yeah, baby steps, Ryan. Come on.
Sure. I guess I was like 15 or something. So, but nevertheless, it's like, I think probably those early things just kind of snowball, right? It's like, oh, this kid was 15 when he was at NASA. I guess we should like give him a shot at this next interesting job, right? So like I got a job at the CDC when I was in college, a very unusual opportunity as an undergraduate to basically kind of create my own little research program and do my thesis research there with resources from the institution. And I think probably I was able to kind of get noticed and get that opportunity because of that early credential, right? And these things kind of just build on top of each other.
Yeah, start stacking. Probably gave you an incredible amount of self-confidence too. Like, someone
I suppose so.
Sees something in you.
Sure.
And then that signals to you that you're capable of doing maybe the next thing.
Maybe. Yeah. I don't know. I don't usually, I think many people work a lot to not seek external validation. This is, again, it's one of the core premises of like the Stoic exercise is to figure out how to distance yourself from external validation. But I think ever since I was a kid, since I was, it was so weird and so, berated and teased and bullied by my peers for being kind of weird and nerdy, that I just like very early on just shut off caring about what other people thought of me. So I kind of just like my attitude, it's almost every job interview I've had, for example, I spend most of the time in the interview explaining to them why they shouldn't hire me.
Right.
And then they always do. And I think that's actually an advantage, but it's not like I can claim that this was the result of like a deep meditative practice of non-attachment. I'm just like, kind of fuck it to external validation. I just kind of want to do the interesting things. And, people appreciate that. Like, I wanted to like play with the cool computers at NASA, and I think people appreciated that. But
and I guess I'll just take a moment to underscore that for anyone who's trying to find their path, age agnostic. I mean, what I hear you saying is lean into your interests.
For sure.
Lean into the things that you want to do, not caring about what other people think of it or what. It's just like do your thing, and there's probably an audience for that or a market for that.
Yeah, I think incidentally there are strategic advantages to that, but my motive, and I would suggest to other people, the good motive is just aesthetic, right? It's like it's less gross to be motivated by something internal and the things that you want and find some little place in the universe where you can fit that into, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of a nice happenstance that oftentimes works out to be strategically useful because for whatever misguided reason, most people don't do that. They do the opposite.
Okay. Yeah, let me ask another follow-up question, which is, so that was then, and this is now. Now with as much competition or noise or other things going on, do you think back then was the best time to start something new like that? Or are there as many or more opportunities now?
What do you mean something new like that?
Well, it seemed like you could just endeavor to do where you had interest. Let's say that was HTML, which was new in the 80s, right?
I guess this probably would have been the 90s by then. But.
90s, fine. Yep. Compared to, if someone has a particular specialized interest now, it's very tempting to just sort of go with the flow or go the easy route, which is, just be employed by someone and...
What literally everyone around you tells you to do.
Right.
Yes,
right.
It's very comfortable.
So do you think, that worked for you back then because there was less noise, less competition, less of that compared to now? Or do you think, well, now here we are in 2024, it's not the 90s anymore, but it's like now there's even more opportunities to lean into that now? Or do you think, no, there's too many roadblocks, whatnot?
I think human nature does not change very much, unfortunately. This is the great disappointment of my hopes in Star Trek, is it's like that premise is human nature is capable of evolution. And my observation is that, unfortunately, there's not a lot of empirical justification for that worldview.
Right. Everything, nothing has changed.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the idea is, the reason I invoke this idea is because I don't think that humans are always extremely mimetic. And so they'll tend to focus on a very small number of things. And if you're just disengaged from that a little bit, there's a million opportunities to do something that's different from what everyone else is doing. Mm-hmm. Just because at any given time, everyone is always going to be on whatever the thing du jour is, right? It's like, especially because of my interest in technology, I've seen this happen, time and time again. There's always some hype thing of the day that everyone rushes to. Like at the moment, it's AI. 15 minutes ago, it was crypto, 3D printing, all of this stuff. And there's always some ends up being some narrow, interesting application of those things, but it's never what everyone thinks it's going to be. And there's always this, enormous gold rush. And, my impulse and the impulse, I think, of people who are wise, business people and investors throughout history is run in the opposite direction always. Mm-hmm. You almost can never go wrong by doing that.
You're right. I mean, conformity, it's so conspicuous sometimes too, right? I just had a scene from a movie flash to my mind, this classic Robin Williams movie, The Dead Poets Society. Remember that scene where they're outside and he's beating the drum and all the kids are out of step until finally, after listening to the drum, they're all in step and they're now walking. He's like, exactly, you fools. You need to march to the beat of your own drum, like Thoreau said,
Right. The reason there's so much literature in this domain, right? And why, because I think a lot of people who write for self-exhortation. They're like, here's a thing about myself that I don't really like, and I want to convince myself and remind myself to do this other thing, right? And so much of literature is about not conforming, right? Mm-hmm. And that's because it's really hard. We need to be reminded. We need movies and literature and poetry to remind us of this important value that runs so against human nature, right? But we have the thing that's important to remember in the 21st century is that, this software that we come into the world endowed with was very functional in small hunter-gatherer bands of 150 or fewer people.
Right.
But now we live in this totally, homogenized mass cultural, world where we're dealing with, semi-anonymized interactions with tons of random people. And it is not necessarily, adaptive or advantageous in the way that it would have been 10,000 years ago.
Yeah, we're not going to run out of the tribe.
Right. Yeah. And so instead we have to think about all of these ways of, strategically dealing with this type of, social sphere that our brains and biology is just completely not evolved to handle. Right. And so we have to dial back and turn off that natural impulse if we wish to make our way through the world and not just be, the 10 millionth person sort of, joining the queue.
Yeah. So let's just cut right to the chase of what I think blocks a lot of people from doing that. And it's a financial question.
Sure.
Okay, so you don't want to work for anyone else. Okay, you want to do your own thing. Great. But the term starving artist is a term for a reason. You might be great, but no one's buying your art. So now what? So how did you bridge that gap between this internal innate, desire to not have a boss, to be your own boss, and the financial difficulties? Did you just fall backwards into money, or did it just come easy for you? Or
no, I mean, it's never been easy, and I think I've been very sort of privileged to have the support of like people in my life. I have like a gainfully employed spouse, which has always been very helpful. But I think that the whole point of this conversation is that it's actually, despite the official narrative, is that it is actually strategically advantageous in any context to actually just kind of do your own thing and be yourself, right? Even in a corporate environment, I think there are all these like untested hypotheses of, well, what if I just do the crazy weird thing? Will it actually work? And there are as many examples of that being much more useful. I mean, we talked about Disney and Steve Jobs and all these people who like very clearly just threw themselves into folly, right? There are many anecdotal examples of that. And yet, in lots of corporate environments where people are worried about their sort of immediate financial future, people kind of cautiously and understandably hedge their bets. I think this is especially it's especially emotionally difficult for people who have like children and families where they're like, it's not just their own like personal artistic trajectory through the world,
right? But
they feel a kind of obligation to be a source of stability and safety and security. Right?
Of course, they may be the sole breadwinner. Yeah.
Yeah. But the question is like, is that actually the correct thing to do? And you don't see a lot of people like really trying that out, like doing the crazy weird thing in these environments and, being ejected and punished for it. So I don't know. You could make a credible case that the safe, less risky, higher reward path is to be a little weird and do your own thing. Mm-hmm. Like I said, every interview I've ever been in, I'm like, you should definitely not hire me. Here are the 20 reasons.
Yeah.
Most people don't go in, if they're like really worried about not getting it, they don't go into it doing that. And they're sort of polite and boring and get passed over, right?
Yeah.
So like the question, it's a very interesting question. Which is the more risky option?
Yeah.
Right?
The riskiest thing to do sometimes is play it safe.
Sure. I mean, it's a platitude, but I think there's a certain truth in it.
Yeah. I love it. And so NASA and the CDC and
British Parliament after that.
How did you learn French? Did you live there?
I wanted to read Camus in the original French. That's really what it came from. So my undergraduate major was experimental psychology because, again, I was interested in these sort of like deep philosophical human nature questions, and it felt to me like that was the way to use the tools of science and empiricism to study these philosophical questions.
This is Carl Jung and a lot of this stuff, or?
No actual scientists. Carl Jung was just like a bullshitter, like an armchair bullshitter, right? But the later, there's somewhere around the 1930s to 50s, psychology started to become sort of reasonably scientific. It's still a social science, so there's a lot of bullshit, but nevertheless, I was, a lot of the early psychologists, William James, Freud to some extent, Jung, were just they're unacknowledged philosophers. Mm-hmm. And I also hold that philosophers are basically unacknowledged poets. It's just so just people kind of spitballing about human nature.
Yeah, trying to figure it out.
Yeah, but not really using any sort of intellectually rigorous tools of science. And that came later. And that was the idea that was really appealing to me. I read this book called How the Mind Works by Steven Pinker, which is a very sort of popular psychology book around the time when I was transitioning from high school to college. And it just the idea of like, wow, we can actually use the tools of science to answer some of these really interesting philosophical questions of like, how does consciousness work? Where does it come from? Mm-hmm. How can it possibly be materially based? What is the origin of all of these emotional impulses we have? Like, I was very interested in evolutionary psychology and all this.
Do you have answers for all of these deep questions?
I have opinions about them based on our best knowledge, for sure. But that's why I studied it. And that's also why I left experimental psychology. It's like I kind of got the answers as far as I was concerned, and I wasn't interested in like publishing obscure research findings that would be read by no one in journals with a circulation of 100 for the rest of my life. Mm-hmm. sorry, what was the question? French. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
My intention was to study psychology, but I sort of did well in the entrance exam for the French department. And so I discovered that like I could pretty easily get a second major in French without having to take too many classes.
Yeah. And
I really liked, as I mentioned, sort of certain French philosophers like Camus, and there was this guy named Roland Barthes, who was a sort of literary theorist, B-A-R-T-H-E-S. I really liked reading them in translation. I was like, oh, it'd be cool to get better at French and read them in the original. And so that was my kind of why I got a second major. But it's been of absolutely zero utility in my adult life. It was just kind of a fun thing to do.
Yet,
we'll see. And maybe I'll move to Paris one day or something.
Or maybe you'll do a deal with a big French investor.
Yeah, that's true.
Conglomerate.
There's a big luxury industry in France for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So who knows?
Mm-hmm. Or you'll do like a collab with Louis Vuitton.
Sure.
Right.
And I mean, to me, the most interesting thing would be to do interviews with like Michel Houellebecq, my favorite French writer, in French, because I don't think he speaks English very well. Something like that would be useful, and it would be like, wow, I actually now, however many years later, actually made some use of my French speaking ability.
Yeah. Again, extracting another lesson here. It's like when you can do something that most other people can't do, it creates access or opportunities. Or again, you may see those quirky little, U-turns down a dark alley, but that's also something that no one else is either willing or capable of doing, in which case that's where opportunity hangs out, I think.
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, we're giving me too much credit perhaps by suggesting that this was all an intentional strategy. I'm just weird by nature, and that has caused me to learn by accident that the sort of less traveled path is oftentimes the useful one. I'm not sure if I were less weird by nature that I would have stumbled into that observation.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And I think, I'm sort of seeing the movie in my mind of your youth, and it seemed like you were whack-a-moled enough by the status quo that you were just like, okay, well, this is not working for me, so I've got to go off the beaten path because there's no...
It was a kind of emotional coping strategy.
Yeah,
sure.
A bit of escape, but also survival, defense mechanism. I can relate with that in my own little tortured way as a kid trying to find my path. Okay, so how did we arrive at the most bespoke keyboard experience I've ever had?
Sure. Well, I mean, I guess this is the original question you asked me at the beginning, and I never answered. Again, a very circuitous, random path. Before this, I guess the short answer is it's a failed attempt at retirement. That's what my keyboard company is. Okay. I had started and sold 3 companies before this, and each one sort of played upon my inherent, diseased workaholism and
weirdness.
And weirdness, for sure. I mean, each of them was also kind of an manifestation of my being drawn to these weird corners of technology or sort of like contrarian takes on things. I was really drawn to Ruby on Rails in its very early days because it was this extraordinarily contrarian technology that had a very specific set of ideas about how software should be written that was completely different from everything else that was done in the sort of enterprise world. And it was this kind of renegade sort of guerrilla movement in software. And so I made a consulting company in that domain. My first company was this startup that was like it was a gay dating startup, which we eventually sold to OkCupid, which is now Match.com. And the whole premise was just like defying all the culture of gay dating at the time, which were all these just like basically hookup apps. And it was like, let's pretend that character and personality matters and have a little bit of information other than 150 characters and naked pictures of yourself. And so, it's always like, I always have some weird contrarian take, and that's the premise of my businesses.
I will say, though, that we're all weird.
Of course.
Right? It's just some of us, are hiding it or concealing it in a way.
Yeah.
And others they see the opportunity with bringing it out and leveraging it, as a strength.
Yeah, this is actually something that's interesting from an evolutionary psychology perspective, which is humans, if you think, we don't really have a lot of insight into what it's like to be, a mole rat or something like that, or a bowerbird. But presumably to us as humans observing the behavior of these species, they all seem pretty similar, right? But humans, in terms of their behavior, right?
Sure.
You study them
mole rat.
superficially, right?
I'm up to speed on my mole rat
Right.
behavior. Yeah.
And so this is my academic training. I don't know. This is what we studied. Things like this. And
I'm tracking.
Sure. It's just from a human perspective, they all seem very much the same. But from a human perspective, humans, we have this extraordinary richness of personality. It's like this strange roulette, right? Of weird combinations that people come into the world with. And I surely there must have been some kind of evolutionary pressure for humans in these 150, or fewer tribes to have people who are kind of like differently tweaked, because it's a collaborative environment. And so in some ways you're almost like a colony or single organism that has different functions, right?
Yeah, you need your alpha, you need your empath, you need your whatever.
Yeah, sure. So it's just like there's this. It's almost built into the generating function for humans to have like a randomizing function.
Yeah, it's interesting to think of it that way, but I think you're probably right.
It certainly squares with our experience of dealing with other people. Like there are some people who just have fundamentally, subjectively different experiences of reality from us and different temperaments and desires and all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly I believe there's a kernel of what makes humans human, but on top of that, there's a lot of variation, right? And I think that we naturally and correctly come into the world with this, but as you say, there is this homogenizing feature of contemporary society that sort of breeds that out of us, because there are things that we decide early on are like economically important and advantageous to us to do. We have to follow certain tracks and paths to do the like socially validated thing, to do the safe thing and be able to provide
there's
families and all of that.
Still the lizard brain, very much. But nature and nurture is very much at play. I wanted to find out how you, after you've gone through such success, that you landed back on this, in particular.
Yeah. So, we were talking about like contrarian businesses or whatever. So I started these businesses at various points. I got to that stage where I'm like, oh, wow, I really need a Tim Cook, or I need somebody else to run this. And
this was starting with the matchmaking.
That's correct.
App built on Ruby on Rails.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Grew into a Ruby on Rails consultancy, which was sort of the most successful of my companies. And the third company was just this little like apparel company based around Ruby on Rails.
Give us a benchmark. Like when you say success, was it $1 million? Was it $100 million?
It was not $100 million. I can tell you that. I mean, so they were, there's always this thing in business, which is this like vanity metric of revenue, right? And so my software consulting company did well on revenue, but it wasn't particularly profitable because with all of my businesses, that's not the fun part for me to optimize for. And I didn't have someone, I didn't have my Roy checking those things for me. And so I always do the like creatively satisfying, cool thing. Like I spend a lot of time writing and advocating for the ideas behind the business, doing like interviews, marketing, talking to clients, crafting the aesthetics of the experience, making a beautiful website, hiring illustrators, all that stuff I love.
Yeah.
Spreadsheet jockeying, not so much.
Yeah.
I can do it in a pinch, but as a result, most of my businesses have never been particularly profitable. But as I say, like entrepreneurship, in my view, is about the creation of assets, right? So this thing that could potentially be of value to someone else, right? It's not just trading your time. You're creating this thing that exists somewhat independent and apart from you. And so in some ways, what I did in each of those cases would create something that other people could do something with.
Yeah.
Right.
The Japanese are very traditionally good at this. They don't always invent the thing, but they perfect the thing.
I've heard that. Yeah.
Automobile. I spent time in Japan, so I cuddled up with that culture a little bit, and they're incredible that way.
Yeah. That's interesting. I think that there's much to be said for that, for sure.
It's just a strength that they have in general. I mean, for generalizing, but
cultures are like personalities, human personalities, like we were talking about. It's better if we inhabit a world where cultures are a little bit different, because then that means that the entire global culture of the world can solve problems in different ways, right? And I think this is one of the sad aspects of increasing globalization. I mean, I'm very much in favor of global interconnectivity and transnationalism and all of these ideas that are very dear to me because they're part of the original optimism around technology from when I was a kid. But one of the downsides of that is if the world becomes very homogenous and we create this monoculture, then if we as a species face a challenge that is, very difficult for us, we may not be in a position to address it because we don't have these weird dissenting, quirky corners of culture.
Yeah.
And it's like it sort of robustifies your species if you have lots of differences in the same way that it does a civilization or a family to have people who are specialists in different things.
Yeah. You need to break things, give it to the Americans.
Right.
You need to keep the rules, give it to the Germans.
Yeah.
If you need to make it precise and work all the time reliably, give it to the Japanese. It's like...
Yeah. So it's like this, a lot of things in science are fractal by nature, and the same observations apply at different levels of analysis. And I think that this is true, like at the individual level, the social, national level, global level, like there's something to be said for dissenters.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm still trying to answer your question and keep getting sidetracked.
That's okay.
And so I sold all of those companies, and kind of like they reached the phase where my contribution, I think, had kind of reached their limit. And also I was dying from horrible stress and anxiety and workaholism. And so, at the end of that phase, when I got rid of the third company, my husband said, why don't you just like chill for a little while? Because we've gotten a little bit of money. Again, he's very gainfully employed. He observed that this...
Can you give us some context on like what was a comfortable amount for you for him to say, take a beat, relax?
I mean, it wasn't about that. It was more like... It wasn't about a specific amount, because I think we're both aware of the fact that it is deep in human nature to always feel like you don't have enough. Right?
Yeah, Bill Gates talks about this all the time. He's like, one of the richest people on earth, and yet he always feels like he's got to look over his shoulder.
Right.
Because the enemy is nipping at his heels.
Yeah, it's truly insane, this like insatiability in human nature. Again, it's one of the things that the Stoics are very preoccupied with, and it's why I find Seneca in particular interesting, because he was one of the wealthiest people in ancient Rome, but he constantly wrote about the sort of not becoming a slave to your wealth, right?
Well, and our mutual friend Andrew Wilkinson in his latest book, Never Enough. I mean, it's literally the title.
Yeah. So like this is a immemorial problem in human nature that we all know about. And so, for us, it was more about the emotional reality and like, is it practically feasible in the moment, and we'll let the future take care of itself. So it wasn't like, oh yeah, now I have a huge amount of money in the bank account. It was like, well, can we possibly survive in the short term? And if not in the future, we'll worry about that later, right? Just because, again, it was like he didn't want to see me quite so miserable as I was, and acknowledging that I just have this kind of insatiable need to work. So I had kind of a year where I just attempted to be retired and not, I worked on a little nonfiction book. I did yoga like 3 hours a day. I read, I thought a lot. I studied various creative pursuits that I never had the time to do before. Like
geographically, where were you?
This was Boston.
Okay.
Yeah. I walked around the Boston Public Garden and read books a lot, and went to the Boston Athenaeum, which is this amazing private library, and would just read for hours and hours a day. And it was like theoretically my ideal life, or at least for my younger academic self, just sort of detached from the world and pursuing my own private ideas that would be consumed by no one. But I have this element of my personality which just like wants to create things and do things that make the world look a little different. Again, it's not like it doesn't even make any sense given my kind of cosmic philosophy that in the end nothing really matters, right? But it's a defect in my character. Like, I have to make stuff. I don't know why. I know that it will not really outlast me. It won't, in humanity itself will be extinguished in some, very determinate amount of time, as will our planet and the cosmos itself. Viewed from almost any reasonable perspective, earthly achievement is meaningless, I believe. But
I appreciate you.
Help it.
I appreciate you saying that, but at the same time, isn't it great that there are people like you who will walk past, a building or see something the way it's built or put together and go, nope, that's not quite right, or that's not as aesthetically pleasing as it could be, and want to fix it.
Sure. I mean we're all the beneficiaries of that, I think.
You're like a fixer, like someone who likes to either create something from scratch that's come from your brain and you see that it can be better, stronger, faster, or more beautiful, make the world a little bit better place while we're here, or you see something that's existing like something like this and you make it 100x better.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of artistic creation and creative activity comes from disappointments of everyday life, right?
For sure.
Like wanting to carve out this little, corner of beauty in the midst, like specifically directly as a response to what you find disappointing in everyday life.
Right.
It's like, it's like Hemingway and sort of writers in general that we've been talking about. Oftentimes they find life a little bit disappointing, right? And there's something about the craft, not like necessarily as a business. Again, like the business aspects of things I usually don't care super much about, but just as an act of creation to kind of make the world a little bit different or better. And I was still like, okay, maybe we can't control and change all the things about society that we don't like and are disappointing and like highly transactional and all these daily interactions that we're like are at odds with our evolved nature. But at least we can carve out this little pattern of beauty, right? So another thing Lovecraft talks about a lot is like in response to this very dark premise, at least we can carve out like a little realm of perfection in our life. And it's usually possible in very modest ways always to do something like that.
I'll go back to the Japanese. Look at the bonsai tree.
Yeah.
The intricacy of just that little tree, the trimming and the care and that's what you're talking about. This is bonsai tree stuff.
Very deep in Japanese culture is the appreciation of the like cultivation of a small little garden of beauty, the literal garden and a metaphorical garden, right? And I like that.
Yeah. They have a lot of nice little philosophies. Also the wabi-sabi, which is, something that's broken that can be fixed is still beautiful.
For sure.
The inaccuracies, the brokenness of it there's beauty in that. Yeah, we could go on and on about that.
But I'm still trying at great length to answer your question, which is how did I end up with this stuff?
Yeah.
Part of these explorations during my attempt at being retired was learning sort of physical creation skills, like because I sort of returned to these enthusiasms from my youth. Like I wanted to make Star Trek props again, just for fun, right? And in order to do that really, really well, I had to learn CAD modeling and CNC machining and surface finishing and all of these things that I was essentially, inadvertently giving myself an education in industrial design. And I did that to my satisfaction over the course of those, idle-ish years.
Where did you buy a CNC machine? It's like $100,000. Did you? How'd you get access to one?
So there was a makerspace in Boston called the Artisans Asylum.
Okay,
and I signed up there, and they had access to machining tools, and they had licenses for SolidWorks, which were thousands of dollars, and classes you could take to learn them.
That's cool.
So that was my entree into it. And again, this was totally recreational hobby activity for me at the time.
Yeah.
So it was I didn't mind using kind of second-rate equipment, used equipment, or whatever, which had been donated. But at the end of all of this, I also kind of like stumbled as an aside into making officially licensed Star Trek prop replicas because there was this company called Roddenberry Entertainment based here in LA that was basically the direct descendant of Gene Roddenberry, and they had this strange deal with the studio that allowed them to make super high-end replicas of props and sell them directly to fans without having to go through the normal studio licensing process. So we made this line of extremely like bizarre, quirky, like luxury prop replicas that were exactly like the studio original. So I would go and because I've always been deep in this community, I would find people who owned originals, I would 3D scan them, and we would create them with extremely high fidelity. And this became, a little bit of another accidental business of mine. Anyway, at the end of all of this, I realized
this is so nerdy and wonderful, right? This is like this is where the magic happens. I love this.
It is what it is. It is what I am. And at the end of all of this, without going too deep into that little mini business, I realized I had this kind of inadvertent degree in industrial design and all of the skills that were required to actually do something that had always been very appealing and exciting to me, which is just like make my own keyboard or, customize my own keyboards. Mm-hmm. And this was very, very early on in the days of this community called Geek Hack Online, which was this, kind of, it still looks exactly the same as when they created it in 1990, whatever, or early 2000s. And it's just like this old internet forum for people who are just unbelievably into computer keyboards for whatever reason. And it was, at this time, it was tiny, maybe 1,000 people or something. I don't know. And I just discovered, wow, there are people who also share my excitement about this ridiculous, obscure thing. And I think for many people, there's different ways that people come to it. Some people are just like really into gaming. So for example, there's always been a really large community in high-end keyboards in Korea because has always been this huge culture of StarCraft and video game obsession there.
Sure.
But I think here in the United States, a lot of people have been drawn to it because, as with me, we associate it with old computers and the kind of, computers used to be rare and they used to be worth investing a lot of money in because they were expected to last a long time. They're now this commodity products and very homogeneous and mostly super cost optimized.
Well, the keyboard is also built into the computer.
In many cases, yeah. So it was this sort of integral system. And so as a result, the makers of these systems wanted them to be satisfying and comfortable to use over a long period of time. So the computers that I grew up learning to program on in the 80s and 90s just had amazing keyboards. And then what we today would call mechanical keyboards. Mm-hmm. And so
kind of bulletproof almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But by the time of this period when I was sort of exploring my maker skills and discovering other people online who had this keyboard obsession. By that time, keyboards had become, it's like a standard Dell rubber membrane keyboard that just comes for free with your keyboard. And that was like the standard
commodity.
Yeah. Anything else was very difficult to come by. And so you had to have this weird community of people online who were just rediscovering how to make keyboards that felt like the really satisfying old ones of the olden days. And I remember being so, like, when I discovered Geek Hack, I think I was like unable to sleep for a couple of days. I was just like reading every single thing, and I just you can go back and read my history on Geek Hack. I was just obsessively posting.
Yeah.
And something about it just like really struck deeply in me because it connected to all of these themes that we've been talking about. This, like, all of my hopes for the future and computing when I was a kid, and also these like maker skills of physically crafting these abstract ideas into something that you can touch.
Yeah, it all came together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the realization that there was other people out there who felt the same way, right? And so I'm like, wow, I guess I could CNC machine a housing for my favorite keyboard. And because I'd gotten one of these Korean aftermarket housings they're very difficult to get back in the day. The Koreans were the first people to come up with this concept of like, let's just do this insane thing of CNC machining a whole keyboard out of a block of aluminum. Right. This was around the time of the early days of the MacBooks, right? Which was this was a very revolutionary concept at the time. Kind of an insane idea, just like take a block of aluminum and turn it into a piece of consumer electronics.
Sure.
So at the time, it was really difficult to get. I'd gotten, for one of my favorite keyboards at the time, this aftermarket aluminum housing, and I adored it. Then a new keyboard came out, which was like based around the same architecture, but it had a new feature basically, and I really wanted it, but you could only get it in this cheap plastic housing. And I kept begging people online to make a machined housing for it, and nobody would do it. So I'm like, yeah, I guess actually I could do that now. So I CNC machined my own prototype at the Artisans Asylum, and it kind of worked. I was like, hey guys, on Geek Hack, I was like, anybody else want to buy one of these? And just to help me pay for the costs of the tooling and the fixtures and everything. And I found several people who were quite interested. I did a little group buy. And from that very first one, I've never been able to keep up with people constantly begging me to make more.
The demand, yeah.
Right. And so it's just like...
What'd you sell it for?
The keyboard?
Yeah.
Oh, it was probably it was very cheap. Maybe at or below cost at that time. And I was using a very cheap, not super high quality shop. It's maybe like $200, $150 or something like that. So
yeah,
similar in cost to the keyboard itself that would go inside. So I guess they just started making their way out into the world and people started liking them. That design I actually regard now as very naive and unsophisticated because it was built around the limited capacities of my machining equipment at the Artisans Asylum because we couldn't do 3D contours and all this stuff. So it was really just like, how can I, as cheaply as possible, solve this problem?
Yeah, it's rudimentary. Well, about what year was this?
That's an interesting question. I often think about that. It was probably about like 8 years ago. And so, because I didn't really formally incorporate this as a business until I think 2017. Mm-hmm. But the actual work of prototyping and doing the group buys was a few years before that.
Yeah, so 2016, 2015.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, in retrospect, not that long ago.
Sure. It's not that long ago in objective terms, But it actually, in terms of the history of the keyboard community, which has exploded insanely since then, I was like among the very first people to be doing this in a serious way, especially in the United States. There's always been a much stronger culture in Asia around sort of high-end computing,
sure,
or at least until recently.
Yeah, that's
but as a result, it feels like a really long time in keyboard terms.
You're the OG keyboard guy
in a way, because I used to go to meetups, even in the Bay Area, in let's say 2016, 2017, and it would be, 40 or 50 people or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it's, they're now over 1,000. Just casual meetups where people will bring their keyboards, lay them out on tables and go try each other's keyboards and just talk about springs and gaskets and extremely nerdy stuff all day long. And so as a result, and there's there's probably, I think there's one other company in the U.S., based here in Southern California, in fact, that was doing kind of like enthusiast stuff at the time. And now there's hundreds. So it's just been an enormous explosion. So it feels to me like a really long time. But you're right, in objective terms, it's quite recent.
Yeah, but I mean, you were at the forefront of that. You were one of the pioneers.
Well, again, that's just overly flattering. It's like you're implying that somehow this was I don't think there's any merit in that. It's just my weird preoccupation with this very obscure thing that just happens by chance to align with something that caught on.
Yeah, but to your credit, and I won't puff it up too much, but it's I think this is the lesson that I'm trying to extract for others who are metaphorically building their bespoke keyboard in their respective brains right now, and that is, first of all, you went off the beaten path. You didn't conform. You wanted to do what you were interested in, even if you're just naturally gravitated or fell backwards into what you found to be consumer demand. You had no idea that this existed before. It was a personal interest. Then you identified the demand. Maybe it was 30 to 40 at the time, but now it's in the thousands.
I mean, a little bit of it also is the actual creation of demand, right?
Right. People didn't know that this could exist, but you visualized it, brought it to life.
I mean, I can certainly not claim singular credit for it, but I think we, as a early keyboard enthusiast community, gradually opened the world's eyes to the possibilities of this thing that most people had written off as this completely outmoded piece of technology. Right.
Right. And I want to just use that metaphor as a model or a template that other people can take a page from that playbook or use that model as a way to experiment with something that they're doing in their space, whatever that is, right? I think it's an important list because back to this full circle moment of the niches, riches are in the niches, you can absolutely do something that's so unique and so maybe even not invented yet, and discover that there's a whole other population or ecosystem that could possibly love what you're doing, and you can make a living out of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, the writer Nassim Taleb?
I know the name of it.
Yeah, he's a really, I love his work. He's one of my favorite writers, also a very kind of interesting contrarian thinker who taught me to question a lot of the things that I kind of learned as an academic psychologist. But he has this idea which appeals to me greatly, which is one of the best most strategically wise ways of kind of expending one's time and resources in life is to be exposed to the possibility of asymmetric payoffs, right? And so it's based on this core observation that most social phenomena, like for example, movie sales or social media influencers, or most things that have some social element to them, have very asymmetric distributions, which is 99% of the distribution is exceeded by the last 1%, right? So if you the top 5 grossing movies or something, if you sum together their revenue exceeds all movies ever made, right? And so many human social and commercial phenomena follow this pattern. And
they call it the 80-20 rule these days, right?
Sure. I mean, well, it wasn't even these days. It goes all the way back to Vilfredo Pareto, right?
I didn't know that, but okay.
But Yeah, it's that is the same core insight, right? Just we have asymmetric distributions in most human social phenomena, and it usually even is, more exaggerated than 80-20. And so oftentimes the soundest strategy in life is to not make massive investments in any one thing, but to have a lot of exposure to things, to those kind of like tailed payoffs, that he would call them, right? And to give yourself a shot. It's like, this is basically the VC model, right? Is you make lots of little bets on things, and the understanding that there's always the possibility that you may be exposed to a huge asymmetric payoff, right?
Right. Most of it's probably going to fail, but
exactly, right? And I think that that's probably the correct way of thinking about the kind of thing that you're talking about, which is like, because there's always the possibility that your personal creative vision that you doggedly invest your entire life in and all of your resources may just really just be your own vision, right?
Right.
There may be zero traction for it whatsoever.
Yeah, or it's mediocre at best.
Yeah, so you kind of have to actually, look around and see whether it's catching on or not. Definitely, my approach has been extreme patience and a very long-term view of that. But nevertheless, like the Star Trek prop thing, for example, like this was not a lucrative activity. It was very, very, like, even more niche than these keyboards by orders of magnitude. And it was clear to me that there's no business there, especially selling it through like a third-party vendor and everything. And so it's not that I'm like completely insensitive to the realities of the market exactly, but I do think there, I want to try to have my fingers in different options, one of which may actually turn out to be something that has an asymmetric payoff, where it's like, oh, actually, this is a nice intersection between my creative interests and some level of possible traction in the world. And it was very clear to me that from even the very early days of what I was doing, that this keyboard thing, luxury keyboards, oddly, had more of that kind of traction than anything that I've ever done in terms of just like actually economic feasibility, but also the just the level of emotional connection and intensity of passion around what I was doing.
Yeah.
Far exceeded anything else that I'd ever done, which is very motivating for me.
Well, yeah, and again, if you missed it, it was subtle, but it's like I want to point out the fact that if you hadn't gone down that quirky, weird path of creating Star Trek memorabilia that was so perfectly spot on, that you didn't get your education in CCing, doing the CC machine and learning that, if you hadn't done that, you wouldn't then have been able to generate that casing that you did from aluminum. So to me, the lesson is there's value and merit in just moving your bones towards something, just doing something.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking about it, do.
Yeah, it's exposure to optionality is how Nassim Taleb would put it, and I completely agree with that. Yeah. And I happen to be blessed with this very ADHD sort of personality that is just drawn to whatever is interesting. Right, and
the shiny object syndrome.
Yeah, syndrome. I mean, I would call it, it's a personality. I don't know if it's necessarily a pathology, because it does actually give you a sort of unfair advantage in life, because you have a little bit of knowledge in a very, very wide domain of things, and it allows you to see intersections and possibilities that might not otherwise exist.
Yeah.
So I've just always allowed myself to like not worry about that kind of evaluation I was talking about that you need to eventually do, like, is this getting traction?
Yeah, or is it practical?
Right. I don't think about that until way, way, way into a project.
Yeah.
Initially, I am drawn to it because I'm drawn to it. And it's like, wow, this is exciting. And I get very, very excited when I'm excited about something new. And in many ways, my life, the reason why I've done so many seemingly disconnected random things is because I'm always just chasing whatever is interesting and exciting and makes me care to get out of bed at the beginning of the day.
Yeah. And that obsessive nature helps you to really hyper-focus, I'm guessing.
Sure.
So like that
serial hyper-focus is a good way of characterizing this personality.
Yeah, and you want to stay up for nights on end reading the material or learning how to do it, or, and that's a superpower.
Yeah, that's a flattering way of describing it, sure.
I mean, that's the common thread you see with a lot of these other...
Sure. There are many successful functions in the world, though, that require the opposite of this personality, right?
Right. So, well, we're really glad that whoever makes pacemakers, in a factory, whether it's robots or humans, they're consistent. They do it, the mundane work over and over. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about finding riches in the niches.
Yeah.
Okay. And so having discovered this opportunity, and basically created the demand in many ways as it's grown. Where is it today? Give us some scale and give us some more context on what this has become.
Yeah, I mean, I think the overall kind of topography of the keyboard world has changed a bit, particularly as a result of COVID and people wanting to optimize their home workspaces. And so this has gone from this high-end luxury and or mechanical keyboards have gone from a very nerdy, obscure thing before 2019 and before or so, into this thing that is now, I think, much more in the public consciousness because people just spent a lot of time looking into how to make their home workspaces nice during COVID. And as a result, it just sort of got on people's radar. But I've always had this kind of long-term vision for what I wanted to do with my keyboard stuff, which was not just entirely or not exclusively targeting this existing enthusiast community, but essentially making a kind of luxury brand and that introduces this passion and enthusiasm to a wider group of people who may not have the patience required to build their own keyboard. So like, before, even up to now, to build your own like highest end keyboard requires a lot of money and a lot of patience. And an overwhelming amount of technical information and choices. So you have to, you can buy like really high-end housing from a company called KeyCult, for example. They're friends of mine who make these very high-end CNC machined housings for keyboards, but they're kits, right? Sometimes they sell for many thousands of dollars, because they're so prized for their quality, and many of them are made exclusively here in the U.S. People are really into it, but in order to even know what to buy or to understand their website is a very high climb for somebody who doesn't spend their whole life on keyboard forums, right? And also, they're based on the Cherry MX switch platform, which we won't necessarily get into the arcane minutia of here, but it's like it's a switch that I feel is not as satisfying to type on as the kind that I prefer, which is capacitive. And so I've always felt that it's like, people go to my website and like, wow, this is so beautiful. These keyboards look amazing. They sound amazing, and all the typing tests you can find of them on YouTube. How can I get one? And I'm like, well, you have to buy this keyboard from Japan. It's sometimes hard to get. You have to void the warranty, take it apart, put it inside my thing. And it's like, it's a big ask of people who aren't really deep into this world. So up until now, what I have always made is aftermarket housings, right? So it's a very enthusiast, very nerdy thing that requires a lot of people. But my goal I've always felt that there are a lot of people who are very drawn to these objects and who may have nostalgia for older computers as I do, or even people who didn't experience this era kind of have it as like an idealistic vision that is alluring to them. This sort of aesthetic and the idea of computing, which with a lot of like satisfying physical manifestations and all of that. I've always felt that there's a wider, market and appeal for that than just people who are willing to spend their whole lives organized around keyboards. And I just like, as a separate matter, I find the idea of creating a luxury brand very compelling and interesting, because it's one of these, the premise of a luxury business is about how do you operate at really low volume, which is to say create something that is creatively interesting and very exciting and thus, not mass market, and then do that in an economically sustainable way. And yes, that usually involves charging a lot of money for it, but that's like all of that, the kind of like the culture and infrastructure around luxury companies, in my view, is about enabling really creatively interesting low volume manufacturing, right? It's not, a lot of people conflate it with social status, and that's true, I think, for people who are very shallowly engaged in these types of brands. But for me, it's like an economic business model for doing creatively interesting things. That's always appealed to me.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the model that Ferrari is on, for example.
Yes.
You make a limited amount. You can't customize. There's a lot of rules and parameters around.
Right, but it's like a Ferrari in particular, it expresses a creative vision about like, this is what a car is supposed to be, and it's singularly Ferrari. And it's also, I think it's analogous to what I do and mechanical watches and things like that, that it's like also a little bit irrational, right? It's like, it's a little bit of a sentimental thing. A Ferrari is a difficult to maintain device that is sort of like, supposedly they break down a lot. They're very expensive to own. They're very noisy. They're kind of uncomfortable to ride in, but it's kind of escapist expression of an artistic vision.
Right.
And to me, like, especially at this point in my life as my fourth company, where I'm kind of just like doing it for creative fun. Like that's where I want to be. So there's this really nice confluence of that desire to have a creatively satisfying company and the fact that people seem to be emotionally interacting with my products in that way. But I'm like, well, I don't think you could really build a sustainable luxury company just selling to this very small audience of people who are willing to do that heavy lift of building their own keyboards. So my long-term trajectory is always, I want to build a keyboard that is as good as like the laws of physics will allow, that you can just buy and plug in and use. And, you know, this keyboard, which I call the Seneca, is my expression of that. And it has been built from the ground up. Every single component, like from the screws to the gaskets, everything has been customized around what we now know as like an enthusiast community makes a keyboard really good, right?
And what does it cost?
So it's probably, we don't actually know for sure, but it'll be around $3,600 is the starting price.
Okay.
That's actually less than some of the aftermarket housings that I sell now. So, you know, I sell keyboards that are like $4,000 that don't include the keyboard.
Sure.
And there's a really passionate community around just those. But
you were also showing me that you have this one on wood. Pick it up for me if you would. And
yeah, sure. It's quite heavy. So this comes off. This is a a lot of people prefer to type with the typing angle because that's what they're accustomed to.
For ergonomics or whatnot.
Well, they think it's for ergonomics, but I don't think that the research supports that view. I think it's just what's familiar.
Okay.
What actually is better from an ergonomic perspective is a completely flat keyboard, because then it allows you to have your wrists straight, and you want to have there's a lot of like research in ergonomics that suggests that the correct way to do it is have a right angle here with a straight wrist. That's sort of the most sustainable. You kind of like float your fingers above the keyboard.
I'm learning. Okay.
Yeah. So that's actually why it's important to me to make a keyboard, and particularly this is the first one in the new line of ready to type boards, one that can be used flat, because that's how I personally type. As a former software engineer, I've really had very bad wrist tendonitis issues. And so it's important to have a keyboard that at least has the option of being used in an ergonomic way. But for people who prefer and are more familiar with the 3-degree typing angle, we have this walnut riser that goes underneath of it.
Mm-hmm. And you've gone to, this seems very deliberate in the packaging. This is interesting to me. Talk about the security. You said that there's knockoffs happening left and right, and
it's amazing given the obscurity of what I do that there are already a vigorous market of counterfeits of exactly my products. They're actually like I've seen copies of my boxes. Right, so they're not just. This is like it's sold as the original, but it's a counterfeit. It's not like inspired by necessarily.
How did you get inspired? Like, talk about how you thought about the packaging and the design. Like, how do you approach all that?
I just do stuff that I like in the premise that other people will find it compelling too. Because of this whole interest in retrofuturism that I have, I'm very drawn to the 1960s, particularly like the Southern California 1960s aesthetic of like mid-century modernism, and this kind of like you notice our logo is a kind of like hand-lettered style that is very common in old signage here around LA, and this color was very common in even like kitchens and packaging and a lot of advertising and illustration of this period. This kind of slightly warm pink. And so I just kind of wanted something that was evocative of retrofuturist, future optimism. And
how about the logo?
So that logo actually you're talking about the circular one, portcullis. So as I mentioned, my first job out of college, or I guess I was technically in a PhD program at the time, was working for a member of the British Parliament in London. And this was kind of a formative experience for me. And I've always just really liked the logo of the British Parliament because it's a crowned portcullis.
Okay.
And this is a stylized kind of modernist take on the symbol of the British Parliament. Just something that I've always liked. I actually used this logo for my old consulting company, and part of the deal with the people who bought it was I got to take the logo.
And talk about this. So how are you using what looks like a passport but is more of a security measure, authentication measure? How are you?
It's actually become in retrospect an authentication measure. I just did it because I thought it would be cool. This is like an old British passport, again, sort of keeping with the theme of like, I don't know, British government or something. And because they had these cutouts where the numbers would be visible through the front, which is not true of U.S. passports. I don't think it's true of British passports anymore. But nevertheless, I thought just the physicality of it was very cool. And I found this artist who does moire patterns, which is the kind of security measure stuff that they put on currency. Mm-hmm. And I had him design stuff with, design backgrounds for the pages that are based on elements of our work. So this is essentially that keyboard and our logo here. And he just creates these interesting complex patterns that are, I guess, hard to copy. Mm-hmm. And because of the increasingly rampant counterfeiting of my stuff, it has actually become subsequently useful to have this little security measure because it's something that nobody has yet copied. Over the long term, though, we're planning on doing some slightly public-private key cryptographic solution where there's a serial number on the ready-to-type line keyboards, where you also have to have a key that can only come from us when you purchase the product to prove that you're actually the owner of it. And we'll create a mechanism for transferring and all of that. Very high-end watch companies do this as well. And it's actually something that many of my clients have been asking me to do because of this problem of there's a whole, vigorous secondary market for computer keyboards. There's a subreddit called Mech Market organized around it. And people are oftentimes unsure if something is being sold as our product, whether it actually is real. So I get a lot of emails from people asking, asking me to authenticate things.
Yeah. Just the attention to detail that goes into every single little piece is just remarkable. I mean, it's amazing. So maybe in closing here, as we come around the corner, how do you look at brand? Like, how do you define what a brand is? And then talk about your brand. What does it mean?
Well, another theme basically that can emerge from a lot of the things we've been talking about is I think good brands are really just people, or frequently a person, right? Definitely there are brands that are not people. I've listened to some of your podcasts, and you frequently like to beat up on Marriott, I noticed, and I completely agree with that, right? Which is that is like a company name. It's like a corporate, that's what you put on your LLC filing documents. Yeah. It's not something that people have any sort of emotional interaction with or sort of connection to as a human. But, we're deeply social creatures. And I think that our way of getting a handle on the world is always to think about things as interactions with people, right? And so really good brands, I think, embody the quirky personality of a person usually, right? Even if that person may be dead, as is the case of like Disney and Apple, for example, the culture in those companies has historically been interested in preserving what the sort of defining founder would have wanted the company to go on doing. And I think that, when companies oftentimes are good brands that lose their way, it's when they become disconnected from the singular personality of a founder, right? And become, run by committee or run by the MBAs.
Yeah, corporations, yeah.
Yeah, and as a result, brand in that case sort of dissolves into something else that is not, I don't know what the word would be for it, but I tend to think of a brand as just being just a person, right?
It's happening with Disney right now, right? Sure. Like they're having their struggles because they sort of lost their identity. They've lost track of the original vision.
Yeah, it's a sort of like corporate holding company nowadays rather than it is as much about the expression of the very singular worldview of this interesting and creative individual. Yeah, and you see, I really enjoy going to the Disney parks, and you really see the effects of that, particularly since COVID and the Chapek era. Like the things that are explicitly built into the premise of those parks has slowly just been dying away, and it's when that happens, you lose your advantage and you lose your market and your monopoly, which essentially is what Disney has had for a really long time in this space. And that's very, very dangerous. But always it's like, this is the core problem with the MBA mindset, right? It's very short-term metrics driven, and it's not about the long-term cultivation of assets, right? Because people like, Chapek and these CEOs, they get their bonuses and they move on, and they don't really, ultimately the incentives are very badly aligned. And if you don't have like a personal investment in a kind of vision that is an expression of you, or the expression of a person or a sensibility, then, slowly that will die away. And it's not that people don't notice, but it is a slow thing that happens. The nostalgic attachment people have to a brand goes away when the things that created it are no longer present.
Yeah.
Right. And that's just because it stops being the expression of a person or a sensibility or a personality, and it starts being, something done by committee.
Mm-hmm. So let's take this opportunity to give some advice to the Disney brand, maybe.
I could do that all day long. Sadly.
Probably because they don't care, but mostly because we can. So how can they sort of begin? We're going to use that as a little case study example. How can they get back on track? Should they bring back Mickey Mouse and everyone, all the characters that got them there? Arguably, maybe Pixar got them there.
Yeah, it's not. I can talk most sort of articulately about the parks in particular because that's kind of my longest standing emotional connection and the thing that I have the most experience with. And it's not like they've abandoned Mickey Mouse or anything, but I was recently watching an interview with Ray Bradbury, who was a science fiction author of the middle 20th century. He was a great admirer of Walt Disney, and this was an interview between him and Leonard Maltin talking about Walt Disney as an optimistic futurist, which obviously is very up my alley, right? And one of the things that Bradbury talks about in that interview is there's this gilded, like lavish spire on top of the castle in Disneyland, and Walt had just seen it somewhere,
right, in
Europe, and he's like, "That's really cool. Let's put that on the on our castle.
I want that."
Right, and it was very expensive and totally unnecessary in any way. In any like meaningful way that you would, again, if you sat down with a bunch of MBAs at a committee, they'd be like, no,
it doesn't pencil. Yeah.
And the Bradbury's point is that like the nucleus of the Disney brand is about doing things that don't make sense in that way, right? Things that, because precisely the point of it is to be escapism from the real world.
Right.
So this is a slight digression, but I think it's important. The train track that runs around Disneyland?
Yeah.
So that's raised above surface level. It's called the berm. And its express purpose is to prevent you from seeing the outside world, right? And there's like this plaque when you enter the park which says, here you enter the world of yesterday, tomorrow, and fantasy. And it's basically the implication is everyday life is horrible and disappointing. Yeah. We're going to give you something else.
Yeah, leave it behind when you come in here. Yeah.
And so it's like explicitly escapism. And Bradbury's point is like the way you do that is you do things that people wouldn't rationally do in the world, right? And so my favorite example of this is in the Disney parks before COVID. If you would go to Main Street in Disneyland at 10 p.m. on Friday night and looked at the water fountains, which are brass, they would be tarnished. Every morning, if you would come in at 8 a.m. the next day, they had been hand polished to a sparkling shine. Again, this does not pencil out. This is crazy. It's an obvious first place to cut because a lot of people would not notice this, right? But and this has ceased after COVID.
Okay, too bad.
And if you do enough of that, you've completely destroyed your brand. And people will eventually cumulatively notice. The park is significantly dirty than it used to be. And this was a huge, it's a core part of the premise of Disneyland, explicitly from Walt, is we don't want this to be like, this is supposed to be a perfect world, right?
Yeah.
And it's cheaper to dust things once every couple of weeks than once a week. But the whole point of why people are paying so much to come here is because we dust every day and nobody else in the world does it because it's crazy, right?
Yeah. I remember a part of the story too that I remember is he was so disappointed when he bought all that land in Anaheim that he didn't buy all the surrounding land where all those crusty hotels and terrible restaurants occupied this clustering effect. So when he did the Florida theme park, he's like, we're buying everything and blocking it.
Make it perfect.
Because we can make it perfect. Yeah. None of those other hillbillies or whatever, that can come in and ruin it.
So, I mean, it's a short travel from there to a $3,600 keyboard. And you can see the connection for me, right? Is I want to create something that is like so over the top crazy that it doesn't feel like it's part of the normal, everyday world of commerce that is hyper optimized for things that, a small group of people will care deeply about in terms of the visual aesthetics, the materials, the acoustics, really arcane engineering from first principles, things that we've done. it's in no way would a rational person who's not a keyboard enthusiast have ever done any of these things. But it's just it comes from my emotional attachment to this idea of people who wish to create some sort of carve out and a bit of escapism in the world like Disney did, right? It seems kind of silly and tasteless because like Disney is this like twee horseshit, basically, is kind of what in the minds of most people. And so there's not an obvious connection between running a very like high design luxury brand. But for me, the emotional undercurrent is very much the same.
Yeah, it's an inch wide and a mile deep.
Right.
Instead of the opposite, right? Inch deep, mile wide. There's a place for that. That's why there's Budweiser beer, right?
I don't drink beer. I don't know too much. What is Budweiser beer? It's like mass appeal?
It's for everybody.
Okay.
It's not great beer, but there's enough people who like it. Or
sure.
Or it's
those are important things.
Popcorn.
Sure. Those are important things to exist in the world.
Yeah.
They just happen to not be the realm that I find very interesting to operate in as a creator.
Yeah. And my point, bringing it back to Marriott, is I stay at Marriott's all the time. I'm a Bonvoy member. Their brand, and they can argue with me about this, I think, is it's a brand that's meant to be ubiquitous.
Sure.
That it's like wherever you land in the world, there should be a Marriott a stone's throw away that's reasonably affordable. That's basically clean. And
Starbucks is another good example of this. It's like drinkable coffee that you can reliably get almost anywhere.
Yeah.
I don't particularly like it, but it's like how you know what you're going to get.
Yeah. The problem with, becoming a commodity is that if there's enough commodity, then you sort of line up in this Amazon style of sort by price, and it's this race to the bottom, either with features and benefits or price, and you could win.
It's very interesting that you should use that term, because that term has been bandied about a lot recently in the keyboard world, because we've very much been experiencing a race to the bottom in enthusiast keyboards. There's been this sort of explosion of kind of $100 to $200 keyboards that are kind of like, perceptibly better than the cheap Dell keyboard, but is all about how do we cost optimize a pretty good experience for a person who may be casually interested in spending, a couple of $100s on a pretty nice keyboard experience. Like I think that's actually, it's quite good that it exists for people who wish to just have an upgraded experience. But I personally don't really want to exist in that space as someone doing creative work, because it's so constraining and uninspired, right? It's all about spreadsheets at that point. Like, how can we take the little rubber gasket and shave a millimeter off of each side so it becomes a little bit cheaper? Like, it's sort of the Amazonification of the world. Everything just increasingly becomes about cost optimization if you don't have something that the product is about that is a little bit more ineffable.
Yeah,
that stands for.
Well, I love brand strategy and I love price strategy too. I'd like to hear how you came up with $3,600 or $5,000 or whatever the price is going to be for this and future units. I think some of the strategy, is regardless of what it costs to make. Usually, your margins, if you're selling product to retail, is somewhere between 10 and 50%.
Sure.
When I worked at Ralph Lauren, I found out that the shirts are made in a factory with all the other shirts. Wherever they're going, you put a polo player on there and Ralph's label, and you can charge $65 for it, even if it costs. But and I think price is one signal or anchor that helps people tell a story to themselves. So how did you come up with the pricing?
The pricing, the high pricing of this particular product is really a result of comes from a different place. It wasn't like I sat down like, we need to make a $3,600 keyboard.
Yeah.
In fact, I'd rather it would be the starting point be somewhat lower than that. But it's just been the premise of this project in my mind has been what could I do that would make me want to go on running a keyboard business that would be interesting. And so again, it was the idea of making my own keyboard from scratch, where I'm not constrained by anything other than making it as good as possible. Costs be damned, right? Once we figure out how to, solve those engineering problems and solve the material and sourcing and quality control problems of delivering what my vision of that is, whatever, we'll charge what we need to, because my experience is that people will happily pay for, pay to support something that invests so much in a thing that would not nobody would do otherwise.
Yeah, it's the Jurassic Park idea: spare no expense.
Yeah, I think that's a good analogy. And so that's my competitive advantage is I am crazy enough to do that.
Yeah.
Right. So like the stabilizers in this keyboard have been unbelievably reinvented, re-engineered from first principles to avoid rattling, but without using lubrication. Right. And this is the standard enthusiast thing: is you buy a normal keyboard and you completely disassemble it, spend hours meticulously lubricating inside of it, and it makes things like the space bar sound really good, whereas they wouldn't as they just come stock. But this is, again, it's asking a lot from people. And so I'm like, there's a better solution to this problem because lubricant seeps away over time, requires maintenance. And so we're like, let's just reimagine stabilizers from first principles. And I hired this incredibly expensive Danish engineering firm to work with me on completely, reinventing this solution. And like at every turn of this key, and that was like well into the six figures, the cost of that project, right? And every little corner of this keyboard has something like that, where I'm solving a tiny little arcane problem.
Yeah.
And I'm like, whatever, fuck the costs. As long as I can manage to get to the finish line, which, I'm almost there, then we'll just figure out what we need to charge for it so that we don't lose money.
Yeah. Well, and this is, back to like knowing your customer, knowing the market. And this is the beauty of probably the Ferrari or the Bugatti Model 2. They're not trying to be the number one volume seller of automobiles in the world. They're trying
to do the opposite.
Right.
By all appearances.
Yeah. And so, I'm just putting it out there for other people who are considering either price strategy or, sometimes I think, what's the old case study of the vodkas at Grey Goose, where they looked at the market and said, well, everyone else is about this price. So just to separate, to be non-conformist, we're going to be 5 or 10x the cost just because.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, I kind of conceptually respect that, although it's a little bit, once everybody knows that that's what you're doing, there's maybe at some level, like people are only buying it for status, which I don't know. I don't find super appealing, but.
Well, yeah, I don't find it personally appealing too, but sometimes there is something to be said for the optics. I'll go back to Ralph as an example.
Sure.
That polo shirt that you're buying at $65 from Ralph Lauren, it didn't cost $65 to make, right? The margins are 60 to 75%.
Sure.
And in the same exact factory, they're cutting and sewing ones that go to Walmart.
I mean, Ralph Lauren is a very interesting example because that brand was always about creating an escapist universe, right? And that's the core advantage of that, of what they offer, is allowing you to step into this alternate, better world that's unlike, everyday life. And I think that it's really hard to quantify that. And obviously just like the cut and sew cost is irrelevant to doing that, because it's something that probably only Ralph Lauren could actually do very well and in the way that he did. And so, like, I don't know, it's hard to calculate markup when the core value proposition you offer is totally non-quantifiable.
Well, yeah, I think you can quantify a little bit, but it's not apples to oranges, right? Like, so this is the whole thing about why brand being distinct is so important if you're building a brand. If you just have a product, look at medicine that we buy that's, what do we call generic?
Right.
We don't care who makes it.
Sure.
We just want it to be effective.
Sure. I mean, that's quintessential commodity.
Effectiveness is just the assumption, like, okay, I assume if I take this ibuprofen pill, it's going to work the same as Advil.
Right.
No difference. I don't care who makes it. But when you have a brand, you should stand for something. You should be distinct. And I think that's how you can command a premium price, is if you are interesting enough or distinct enough or special enough. And that's why people still buy Ralph Lauren products, because, Ralph imagined what they wore in The Great Gatsby, or, bringing back fashions from Britain, or, aviators flying in World War II. Like, he has this vision, and so you're buying into it. And when you pay the premium, then you also kind of want that same, either like the story you're telling about yourself is like, oh, I relate to that fashion sense, or I'm trying to escape in a certain way. And so you buy into it because it also helps you express what your personal brand is. I am someone who would spend $5,000 on a bespoke keyboard because that's the kind of person I am. I'm attention to detail, or I am someone who is not like everyone else who buys the Dell, off the rack freebie or whatever. I am someone different. So it's a way to express yourself as well.
And also, sort of like stepping under the berm at Disneyland or going to a movie or something, buying a Ralph Lauren product, it may require some level of self-deception or willing self-deception to just kind of step into this fantasy universe. But that's sort of part of the value proposition.
Well, that's the
really
price
like
you
that.
pay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, like there are definitely luxury brands and sort of these kind of escapist commercial experiences that really appeal to me, including going to Disneyland. And I recognize that it's like an intentional, emotional, trick I'm playing on myself to, enjoy a certain type of experience that isn't, is a little bit of an elevated experience. And you kind of have to be willing to play along with that.
Right? Yeah, and I can appreciate your humility in saying that you're playing a trick on yourself, but I'll push back on that to say it's one of the ways of self-expression. If I buy a Ferrari, I recognize that I could get from A to B just as easy, probably on a bicycle.
Sure.
But I put myself in a Ferrari because I identify with, Enzo Ferrari's vision or the need for speed or, whatever else that brings me. And so that's the way, maybe the only way that I can self-express.
That terminology is in no way to denigrate it. I mean, everything I think that is really beautiful in human life involves some level of this kind of self-deception. The greatest fiction, poetry, films, like art fundamentally provides these forms of escapism, stepping into a different universe that is not reality.
Right.
This is not a problem as far as I'm concerned. It's a really important value proposition.
Yeah. Well, I just didn't want to have people think the word trick triggered me a little bit.
Sure. Yeah.
But there's no trick about something so special and handcrafted and so much care and time being put into it. There's no trickery.
Well, I think it is genuine. There are two elements to the value proposition. It is genuinely extremely nice and satisfying in a way that any human who doesn't have any associations with it can appreciate. Like I can,
right.
But there's also an escapist element about the story behind it and the ideas behind it, and like the values about the optimistic values about the future of technology that the object embodies, which is a little bit, it's a little bit more abstract and conceptual, right? And it requires you to kind of go along for the ride willingly. And I think actually that's what the best brands give you the opportunity to do that, right? Is to not just solve a problem in your physical world, but to step into a world that is a little bit better, right? And a little bit more satisfying.
I mean, we were just sitting back, chopping it up, reminiscing about the good old days and all that. Tracking my roots, where I came from. And